this month sees an update to the employment law changes. Many of you will have already joined us for events where we have been talking about this already, particularly around the changes to sexual harassment laws in the workplace. And we also know that trying to address this in an old-fashioned way is not going to be the right way to do it. So Matthew and I have been we've been talking for most of the year.
A long time.
Long time.
Certainly most of this year.
Yeah. In order to be able to put something together that combines legal knowledge, cultural skill, and DEI work as well, to bring all of our work together to be able to address this particular challenge in workplaces in a much more effective way. So I'm going to be asking Matthew to just explain a little bit more about the campaign against unwelcome workplace attention in a second. But Matthew, if you wouldn't mind just very briefly outlining what the changes to the legislation.
Yeah, as Nina says, we've been talking since the beginning of the year about the changes which are coming into force in about 3 weeks' time. There's been a sense for many years now that traditional responses to sexual harassment, in particular under the law, are not working. Tribunal claims are very difficult to bring. It's very much a he said, she said type process, and that's proving not to be successful. What's happened instead is there's been sort of consequences outside the law. The most obvious high-profile one is Me Too. But as we were hearing earlier, and we all heard last week, Harrods now just uncovering some really awful things that were happening 20 or so years ago, and arguably were either turned a blind eye on by the organisation, or in many cases, the organisation seems to have been facilitating it. And as I said, this has been a theme that's been coming through. What do we do about this? How do we address sexual harassment in the workplace? Because we know it's an issue. It was initially a private member's bill, but the government adopted it, the last government adopted it, decided to make a change in the law, which was to move the culture from very reactive, and our obligations being very reactive, to being much more proactive, and essentially to apply a duty on all employers to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. Okay, it's as simple as that. As I said, that duty comes in towards the end of the month. It's a big change of thought and a big change of focus. Whether it ends up being a big change of action is another matter, and that's maybe why we've all got to focus on it now. Just a quick word about how the change is going to be enforced, how the new obligation is going to be enforced. It's going to be enforced in two ways. First of all, if an employee or an applicant brings a claim at the tribunal and is successful with a sexual harassment complaint, and the tribunal finds that the employer has not taken reasonable steps to prevent harassment in the workplace, then that can increase compensation awarded. So that's number one. Number two, the Equality and Human Rights Commission will have the power to be able to investigate employers, and if they find that the duty is not being complied with, then they've got a range of enforcement methods which they can use. So it's twin-pronged. It's individuals taking claims at the tribunal. It's regulatory via the Equality and Human Rights Commission. What's interesting is there's no standalone complaint, so it won't be possible for an employee to say, you have not done this in the workplace, you have not put in place reasonable steps, and therefore I am making a claim to the Employment Tribunal. It's only going to be on the back of a claim for unlawful harassment. So that's the duty in a nutshell. A couple of things about that. It's reasonable steps. It's not all reasonable steps, so you don't have to do absolutely everything to do so. Secondly, that tribunal enforcement bit, I think, is going to be a problem with actually getting this as an effective piece of legislation, because actually very few claims ever proceed to tribunal. Most sexual harassment claims are dealt with in other ways, or, and this is part of what we're doing, they're not dealt with at all, okay, and it's pushed under the carpet.
A lot of the conversations that Matthew and I were having was around the feel-bad factor of traditional sexual harassment training, which can be a little bit around telling people what they're doing wrong and what they shouldn't do and putting the blame on them. So actually, what should we be doing differently?
I think there's a couple of things. It's really interesting we're talking about management capability, I think, in this context, because a number of things occurred to me when I was starting to think about this legislation. One was actually how unimaginative it was, and how when you started to see the initial responses to it, it was about doing two things. It was about having a policy and having training. And you think, well, whoopee-doo. Number two, it got me thinking, well, this is great for lawyers. Any bit of new law is great for lawyers, but at the same time, lawyers think we know everything. And when we see a new bit of legislation, we think we know it all. And we don't know it all about this. And that got me reading more widely into this subject. And many of you will know that in the States, we have had in many of the US states, there's been mandatory training, mandatory responses to harassment, and in particular sexual harassment, for many years. So there's quite a lot of data, quite a lot of research on this. And what this data is starting to show is that these traditional responses, in particular the traditional way we do training, which is typically to get a group of managers in a room and say, this is what harassment is, you naughty people, don't let this happen, and if it does happen, this is what it will cost, are ineffective. It doesn't work. Indeed, some of the research actually suggests that it is counterproductive, and in those organisations that believe they're doing it right, you actually see fewer women progress up the organisation. That happens because of the accusatory nature and the victimisation that occurs when those accusations are made. So we started to see that the traditional response to this should not be all legal, and also that it would need to look different to what we naturally do, which is to think, let's tell everyone what harassment is and how bad it is. So that's where I thought, well, that's as far as lawyers can go, really, with this. And actually, we need to do something else. And what do I do whenever there's anything which is HR? I speak to Nina. I particularly wanted to speak to Nina because of her expertise with comms, HR comms, because I think, again, what occurred to me is that this is largely cultural, and it's about making sure the message is getting right in the particular business, and that's all about how it's communicated.
Absolutely. We talked a lot also, and for those of you who came to the HR Heads Together session that we ran on this topic, so much of the conversation in the room was actually around psychological safety.
Yeah.
How do people talk about themselves in the workplace, which is a much broader topic than sexual harassment, but if you don't feel psychologically safe in the workplace, you're not going to be reporting harassment. And what else? What else is going on?
Absolutely. And so when we go back to management capability, that's what we see. What do managers have to do? They have to communicate effectively. They have to set that culture. They have to create that environment of safety. And that's where I think we have to anchor our response to this piece of legislation, in that cultural area, starting at the top, and then looking at how we make sure that it is something worthwhile within any particular organisational culture.
Right, so that's great. So what are we going to be doing about it?
What are we going to be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. What are we going to be doing about it? Absolutely. Where do we start that process between you and I and the clients that we are hoping will come with us on this journey? What's that starting point look like?
Starting point is actually to have some honest conversations with the senior people within the organisation. Probably starting out with senior HR people, moving on to the senior management team. You've got to get this outside of HR. It's got to sit with the board. It's got to sit with the executive team. So again, this is where we started to think, well, it's worthwhile teaming up. Because one of the advantages that we can have as lawyers is we can do these conversations in a very privileged way. We have the ability to actually sit down with a manager, with a chief exec, with a CPO and say, yeah, we've got a problem. What are we going to do about it? And know that that conversation is happening in a privileged environment. Okay, so we thought, actually, there is a role for lawyers in this, in making sure that that privileged environment is there to have these conversations. So very honest information gathering is the starting point. Conversations. Also, we've developed some information which we'll be happy to share around actually profiling an organisation. What kinds of organisations are going to be more exposed to the risk of harassment than and harassment claims than others? What organisations are going to have to do more about it? And the fact is, most organisations are going to have to do something, but each organisation is going to have to do something slightly different. So we've tried to prepare a document which will enable organisations to actually get an idea and an insight into where their particular issues may lead.
Absolutely. So starting with those really honest conversations, being able to talk to a leadership team underprivileged about where those risks and challenges might be, but then going into it and thinking about it culturally, because we absolutely believe that when it comes to a topic like this, employees are the solution, they're not the problem. You know, it is going to take your people to come with you to actively choose to do something different. So therefore, when we're looking at it culturally and through the lens of EDI, we are looking at things around psychological safety, about what people can do proactively, as comfortably as they feel, to be able to mitigate or report or talk about this situation, rather than telling people that they're the problem or telling people all the things that they shouldn't do. So we've got this multi-pronged approach, really, to be able to support people depending on the industry, depending on the particular challenge they've got, depending on whether or not they know what the challenge is that they've got. So I think really the call to action here is around, and absolutely, as we've mentioned before, let's get the data, let's get it right, let's make sure that you actually know the position that you are in, and then what can we do? So what should people do if they are interested in this topic and want to have that conversation? They're coming to you, they're coming to me, coming to both of us?
They can come to either of us or both of us and have that conversation. I think, like I say, we are not promoting a one-size-fits-all. So there might be principles that underlie it, but in effect, each business is going to be different. So have the conversation, talk to us about where we think the first steps are. We'll share with you the questionnaire we've put together. We'll share with you the template report that will produce, and we can start to think, well, okay, how's this going to work in your business? Is this something which is going to be valuable for your business, for your organisation? And then we can move it on, and we can start to talk about, well, okay, if we complete this, how are we going to sell this to the business? How are we actually going to sit down and talk to CEO, CFO, etc. about this, to start to work on it, to actually start to build into the business something which is a proper response, not just to the legislation that's coming through, but to what we know is a wider problem around harassment in the workplace.
Brilliant. Thank you for explaining far better than I ever could. I know obviously it's something that it is going to be arriving in our workplaces very soon. So how you think about it, how you want to address it, obviously we would absolutely love to be having that conversation with you. So thank you very much.